Hello and welcome to EE 333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take a look at our main in our fundamentals driver. This is part of a series of videos that focuses on the fundamentals of Java, how to run it from the command line, some of its similarities to C and other languages, and more importantly, how to start setting up both object-oriented and non-object-oriented projects. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to look at our main and specifically the input arguments to our main function. Remember, our main is the main entry point that's called when you launch the Java runtime engine and you specify, in this case, the fundamentals driver class. Also note that we are putting all of this in our EE 333 package. So to begin with, you'll notice that the args is an array of strings. And so, as we mentioned in an earlier video, we can leverage the length of that array to be able to determine what is in it. And so to begin with, we first want to just practice navigating it, much like we did with C. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a for loop that allows for me to loop through each one of the arguments. Now, keep in mind, our whole goal here is to clean up main so that we can ultimately use main to call other functions as we're demoing and practicing different features in Java. So to begin with, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to set up a for loop or use a for loop to loop through or to look at the elements in the args array. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're simply going to use a similar syntax to what we used in C, with the difference being is that we're actually going to declare a temporary variable inside the for loop and initialize it as part of our initial condition for the for loop. So in this case, we want to use an integer. We're going to call it index, and we're going to start off with 0. And then, like in C, Java is 0-based. And so what we can do is we can continue incrementing this index while it is less than our args, and in this case, length. And then we can simply increment our index. Now, what I'd like to do is two things. First, I'd like to just see how many elements are actually in our args. So to do that, we'll just simply say system.out.println. And in this case, I'm just going to have a nice friendly message here or something on the command line that tells me what I'm actually trying to do. And that's going to be args.length. And then what I want to do is I want to append to that the arg count. And to do that, we simply use the plus sign to concatenate, in this case, a string, and what you will see will be an integer, but ultimately will get implicitly converted to a string. In this case, it's going to be args.length. Now, we'll come back to this in just a little bit. We're actually going to need to do more explicit conversions later on. But in this case, when we attempt to add an integer to a string, it gets implicitly converted to a string. And we'll see how that happens in just a little bit. Now, continuing on inside the loop, what I want to do is something similar using my system.out.println. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to not only print the index, but also the value at that specific location. And once again, just trying to make it look somewhat nice here, we're going to say args square brackets, and then I'm going to append to args square brackets simply the value of index, close the curly braces, or excuse me, close the square brackets. So once again, this is the part that's simply being printed. And then the value at that location, I'm just simply going to once again add as a string. And in this case, it's going to be args square brackets, and then whatever the value is at that location. And notice this is little bit different here. This is, of course, an array of strings, so we've got no issues with the concatenation here. But once again, we are implicitly converting an integer into a string. And once again, we'll see how to do that explicitly in a little bit. So temporarily, what I want you to do to see this demo work or see this part work, I want you to comment out every other bit of code that you might have. And at this point, then let's go ahead and build it. If it's successful, we want to go find this project on in our projects folder using the command line. So in this case, users, my G. Myers account, documents, EE333, or courses rather, EE333, projects, and we want to focus now on our fundamentals demo. And remember to occasionally do a dir so you remember where you are, see where you are on the file system. And in this case, we want to go down the build directory. And there is our classes folder. So we want to jump into our classes folder. And now you see the EE333 subfolder. And just as a quick reminder, you can jump in it to see that, yes, there in fact is your fundamentals driver.class. We want to jump back out so that we can run that class using the Java runtime. So in this case, we're going to say Java EE333 and then fundamentals driver. No class, no extension needed on this. And so, it would help if you spell it correctly. There we go. Fundamentals driver. There we go. And you see that quite simply it just says args.length is 0. Well, it's a little different than in C, because in C, the executable itself counts as an argument. In Java, when you are using the Java runtime engine, there are no arguments being passed to the EE333.fundamentals driver class, hence the length is 0. What we can do is we can append additional arguments onto the call here. In this case, we'll just call this first one arg1, rather lackluster in its creativity, but you'll see that now my args.length is 1 and my args square brackets 0 is reflective of the arg1. Now, little minor typo here. I like to have another space there, no big deal. That's just in aesthetics, but since you noticed it, let's go ahead and take care of it. And now you'll see there my arg1 is, or my arg0 rather, is that argument 1 that I passed. Continuing on with that, I can add another argument. Sure enough, my args.length is now 2, with my 0th argument being arg1 and my first argument being arg2. Well, what happens if we want to pass arguments that have spaces? Well, that's no big deal. We can simply put double quotes around it. So we have arg3 with spaces, and you'll see that my total argument count is 3, and that last argument includes spaces. Okay, so that double quotes then surrounding your entire argument allow for you to do things like that. So how would this actually be practical? Well, let's give something a little more realistic. Let's say, for instance, that you want to capture the user's first name, their last name, and then maybe their address. So in this case, 123 Sample Way is my address, and you'll see that I can capture the user's first name, last name, and then also the address from the command line. Now, one last thing to point out, that if we put a number in by itself, that is still going to be reflected as a string when it is pulled in from the command line. So essentially what we have to do is we have to verify that a particular argument is in fact an integer before we can use it as an integer, and then we need to convert it to an integer. So just keep in mind that the arguments that are pulled out of your args are strings. Okay, and then from there, you have to convert them into the data type that you intend for them to be. Well, moving forward with this, how can we leverage this further? And specifically, how can we use this to make calls to specific functions? or have specific set of actions. And we're going to start off with our static demo, our instance demo, and also our get info from earlier. But we'd actually like to add one more static function, and that is going to be a help function, much like what you would have done in your C executables. This helps a little bit in the documentation process, but also just helps your user know how to use your application. And so what we're going to do is somewhere down here, whether you do it before or after the get info doesn't really matter. I like to keep mine relatively close to my main. So in this case, what I'll do is I'll put it in right after the main. I'm going to have a static function because it does not necessarily depend on an instance of an object. I'm going to have a public static, and I could have it return a string, but for this example, I'm simply going to have it be a void return value, and I'm going to call it help. Nothing creative there. And what we'd like to do is inside this help is simply leverage a bunch of system.out.print lines, and specifically we'll start with the usage, and then I'm going to get a little lazy here and copy and paste. And we'll start by just simply having a few of these so that we can fill them in as we go along. But then what you'd like to do is you would like to specify which switches or which arguments call which function in your Java application. Well, to do that, let's take a look at what we want to have happen. And so up in our main, we had specified functions like get info, and then the ability to call, for instance, our instance demo, as well as the static demo. But the only way we had any control over which one was called was simply by commenting and uncommenting. That's not very efficient, because that means that every time you want to change the functionality of your application, you have to open it up, modify the Java code, and recompile it. Instead, what we'd like to do is we'd like to add the features and then perhaps control what gets done by simply picking which switch you would like to use. So to continue with that, what I'd like to do is take just a second. I'm going to move my loop up just a little bit closer to the top, because essentially at this point, all it's doing is helping us. So as a matter of fact, at some point, we can actually decide whether we want to comment this out entirely. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to only call my static demo when the user provides the switch that indicates that they want to call the static demo. Now, if you'll note from our command line discussion just a little while ago, that essentially the first argument that's passed after the Java class is the first argument that the main sees. So in other words, what we would want to do is we would want to check to see if args square bracket 0 is in fact equal to the, in this case, static demo. And I like to put a slash in front of it to indicate that it's a switch. So what we want to do now is we want to use a series of if statements to essentially triage our command line arguments. The other thing to note when you go back to the command line is the number of arguments that are going to be required. So for instance, if we simply want to pass one argument that indicates the switch that corresponds to which function we want to call, then we can also leverage the fact that the args.length will be equal to 1. So right off the bat, that sounds like we have a combination of conditions. In other words, we want to look to see that our args.length is equal to 1, and in fact, that args square bracket 0 matches the particular command line switch that we were looking for. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this. So to begin with, what we want to do is we'll focus on this static demo. And so we can start off by simply saying if our args.length is equal to 1, and our args square brackets 0, and now this is where it's going to get a little bit interesting. We have, if we follow up the square brackets with a period, we could actually see the functions associated with a string. In this case, these are instance functions or instance methods. And if you'll notice, there is a equals ignore case. And so what this does is this allows for us to compare an existing string with another string. Now, we will talk more about why we have to have an existing string in just a little bit. But for right now, what we want to do is we want to leverage the function associated with that string object. In this case, it's going to be args, square bracket 0, dot, equals ignore case. And then this allows for us to compare to another string. In this case, since we are going to be focusing on our static demo, we'll use a slash, and then we're going to simply use the name of the function, and we'll use it as the name of the switch, just simply prefaced with a slash. And then if you take a look at the help for equals ignore case, and we will in just a second, we'll notice that it will return either true or false. And I like to explicitly state whether or not this is equal to true. You can leave that last part off, because as long as this returns true and the args.length is equal to 1, then together, since it's an and, this will be true. But once again, I like to explicitly compare it to true. Well, what would we like to do if this is the case? Well, we can go back down here to our comments, and we can simply move them up. And then at this point, we simply uncomment out the code that we would have left in earlier if we were interested in running the static demo. So the only time this code will now run is if, in fact, the user types in the fundamentals driver followed by /static demo. It does not matter whether they put it in all caps, lowercase. If they accidentally mess up the case, it's only going to compare the strings and look at them in a case, ignoring the case or a case insensitive context. Now, we can do this with our other options, and we'll just simply follow this up with a else if. For all of these, for right now, we're going to be looking at args.length equal to 1. And then the second condition is going to be some derivative of args square brackets 0 dot equals ignore case. And once again, it just depends on which switch we're looking for. So if we look at the second example, we're going to look at our instance demo. And if that is equal to true, then what do we want to have happen? Well, we want to run this entire block of code, which means that we can move this up into the else if branch. At this point, we can just uncomment out the relevant parts of the code to actually run it. We're going to go ahead and leave the comments that we made in the earlier video in place, talking about why you have to declare and initialize a new instance of fundamentals instance. If you have not yet watched that video, I encourage you to do so. And then the third example that we want to handle is going to be the get info. So else if, once again, our args.length is equal to 1, and our args square brackets 0 dot equals ignore case. And in this case, we simply want to compare it to the get info end. If in fact that is equal to true, then we simply want to call get info. Now, hopefully at this point, you can see how you can simply just add more and more functionality to your Java class. And at this point, just test it. A couple of comments to make is, number one, I've been slightly inconsistent in my use of spaces. I'll try to make sure and space this out just so that it's a little easier for you to read. Aside from that, Java does not really care so much about the spaces. The second thing to note is that we make no explicit calls for help, meaning that when we run our Java class, what we'd like to have happen is if we put a /? in, we'd like to be able to have some sort of help to the user, or perhaps even a /h. Now, to accomplish this, we can do a number of things. It would probably make sense to have that be the first argument that is being tested, because that way it eliminates testing all of the other options if, in fact, the user just simply wanted to see the help. So we're going to do a little bit of rearranging here. We're going to start off, I'm going to go ahead and insert another if statement above here, and we're going to go ahead and look at our args length equal to 1. And then just as before, we're going to look at args square brackets 0. And if that is equals ignore case and it matches the /, then we simply want to make a call to our help function. Well, right now our help function doesn't do a whole lot, but we'll get back to that in just a second. We can then just insert an else and then bring the if statement up and then combine the two or join the two if statements. But I said just a second ago, I'd like to be able to handle both scenarios, the / as well as the /h. So this is going to involve a little bit more tweaking on this logic. Specifically, we want to check to see if our args.length is equal to 1 and our args square brackets 2 dot equals ignore case is either a /, or using the double pipe symbols, a args square brackets 0 dot equals ignore case. And this is now starting to get a little bit long. If this matches the /h, and that is in fact true. And at this point, then we just have to verify that we've got all of our parentheses matched up. We'd like to make sure, so in this case, we have to make sure that the individual tests or conditions have parentheses around them. So far that's good. And then we have one more grouping for the outer, and then finally the third that includes this and. So basically the way this is evaluated is if this condition is not met, neither of the other conditions are tested. So first of all, we don't have to worry about wasting our time with these if in fact we don't have an args length equal to 1. Now, then inside here, if this case right here is true, then the second condition is not tested, because remember that it only requires one of the two to be true. In both cases, we're referring to short circuiting. So in an and, if the first condition or if any of the conditions are false, then the execution of an and stops. And in an or, once the first condition is true, then no further execution of the condition statements is necessary either. In both cases, then that is going to be referred to as short circuiting. Under the help, then here, we can refer to this as an explicit call for help. Why is it explicit? It means that the user actually wanted to see the help, which brings us then to the last point here. The else branch of our if should have an else on it, in which case there is another call for help. And this is an implicit call for help. And why is it an implicit call for help? Well, because the user didn't intend to, they just didn't know what they were doing. And so if you look at the way we have our logic currently set up, the user can get here by virtue of putting in too many arguments or simply putting in one argument that we do not recognize. Now, there are more than one way to go about doing this. For instance, we could have also nested this logic and looked first at the args.length equal to 1, and then in that branch, then handled the values for args square brackets 0. Don't spend too much time dwelling on that right now, because we will get plenty of opportunity to triage our command line switches as we plan to use them extensively in the future. At this point, let's just be happy that this thing is building and come back out here to the command line and test some of our switches. So we'll start with our /h. We get our usage, but we don't actually get any help. So let's take just a second to at least put in what the switches should be. So coming up here, we see that we're supposed to have a static demo, an instance demo, and then lastly, the get info. And if you want to be nice to the user, we can have either /h or /?. And then the other thing that would be nice is to simply give them a comment about what this does. So it calls help. Does not require an object. Once again, this is probably a little bit more detailed than what your user would expect, but once again, we're sort of trying to do two things: documenting what we're doing, as well as providing some information on the command line. So for an instance demo, this requires an object. And then lastly, the get info says something about the author. All right, so let's see how this looks now. We come back out here, we run our /h. We've got a somewhat professional looking help. Doesn't look too bad. /?. Once again, you'll see that we get it. Now let's try some of our other switches. So our static demo, and you'll see that it makes a call to the static demo. We could probably improve on that ever so slightly, just to make it a little more obvious what's going on. How about if we say calling static demo and calling instance demo, and then the get info is probably noisy enough. In other words, it's got some print statements in there, so we probably don't need to add anything there. But let's see now. You'll see that it says calling static demo. How about if we say instance demo? Sure enough, there we go, calling instance demo. And then our get info. And sure enough, all of these seem to work. So hopefully this was very useful, and if nothing else, a pleasant refresher from how you would do this in C. I'm going to take a few more minutes to clean up my code. I would encourage you to do the same. But basically how you're going to use this is you're either going to create static or instance methods associated with this class. And as you add more functionality, you simply add more switch combinations and you improve your help. This gives you a platform for rapidly testing or prototyping different things in your job application. So I encourage you to do something similar to this in all of your projects. As always, I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.